By late March, the war in the Mediterranean having expanded, the Regia Marina intended to sink troop convoys heading from Egypt to Greece in company with the Regia Aeronautica and the German Luftwaffe to defend against such an attack. Admiral Andrew Cunningham put to sea with Warspite, Valiant, Barham, and the carrier Formidable, screened by cruisers and destroyers. The ensuing Battle of Cape Matapan between the 27th and 29th of March 1941 was one of the most decisive fleet engagements of the war in the Mediterranean at 9:11 p.m. On the 28th of March 1941, when the commander of the cruisers, Admiral P.R.M. Whipple, reported a stow ship, this being the Italian cruiser Pola, Cunningham steered his ships in the reported direction. By 10:23 p.m., the escorting destroyer spotted shapes on the horizon, and 2 minutes later, the outlines of two ships could be seen. These being the cruisers Zara and Fiume detached to assist the crippled Pola, where I think Dark sees the Battle of Cape Matapan puts things better than I ever could. The next few minutes were decisive. The CNC altered course to starboard, bringing the fleet again into single line ahead. Almost at the same time, Greyhound, which was then drawing ahead, opened her searchlight. Its beam fell across the water most valuably, illuminating a cruiser without revealing the position of our battleships. The Formidable, being obviously of no value in a gun action, hauled out of line to starboard. The Warspite's turrets opened fire, followed almost immediately by the Valiant's. A salvo of 15-inch shells crashed into the Fiume. Her after turret was blown overboard. She listed heavily to starboard and burst into a sea of flame. She was driven out of line and seems to have sunk or blown up. 30 minutes later, just before the enemy cruisers were sighted, the Barham in the rear of the line had setted the POA on the port quarter, making identification signals, and had trained her turrets onto her. When the Greyhound's searchlight shone out, the B trained forward at once, opening fire on the leading ship. A brilliant orange flash shot up under the bridge, and bursts were along the whole length of the ship, which turned to starboard and made off to the westward, making smoke. The B then shifted to the Zara. The latter had been heavily hit, and a big explosion forward hurled one of her turrets overboard. The action lasted barely 5 minutes, shell after shell crashing into Italian ships, which were caught unprepared with their guns for and with that, one of the most decisive engagements in the Second World War, and the most decisive engagement in the Middle Sea, ended with the loss of 3 Italian heavy cruisers, the Zara, Pola, and Fiume, along with 2 Italian destroyers. In today's video, we'll cover the losses of the cruisers in background detail. Before we continue, I think I'll open up with a quote from Massacre in his book, Mellini's Navy, a Reference Guide. To the Regia Marina 1930 to 1945, the 4 Zara-class ships were surely the best Italian heavy cruisers, and exceptional conditions of the loss of Zara and Fiume. At Matapan, wrecked by 15-inch shells fired at almost point-blank range, do not allow for a fair judgment of their robustness to be made. At the Battle of Spartivento, Pola hit the cruiser HMS Barrack with 2 8-inch shells, knocking out one of her 8-inch turrets. In the brief gunfire action of the First Battle of Sea, in December 1941, Gia damaged the destroyer HMS, chipping with a near miss. Please do keep that part about their robustness in mind while thinking about the damage to these ships. I don't intend to cover the full Battle of Cape Matapan, including the action off Gavdos. So we'll start our story on the evening of the 28th, when following the action off Gavdos and the battle between Yoko's flagship Vorvedo, his cruisers under Sanati, and the British cruisers under P.R.M. Whipple. During this time, the British began sending carrier-based and land-based airstrikes against the Italian ships, targeting the Victor Vedo. However, Pola, who had not played a large part in this engagement, was the unfortunate recipient of one of those British torpedoes and had to slow to not hit her sister ship Fiume. Pola lost electrical power and drifted to a stop, where to take from her Mino Bonesco and Austo d'Oro in Italian heavy cruisers from Trento to Bonneau at 7:50 p.m. During the air attack at dusk on the 28th of March, an 18-inch Mark 12 torpedo with a burst charge of 176 kilograms of TNT struck the PO on the starboard side in line with the boiler rooms number 4 and 5. Without any visible water column, the space was immediately flooded, and due to the collapse of the bulkhead, the forward engine room starboard and boiler room number 3 were inundated as well, while the after-engine room port in boiler rooms number 6 and 7 were also flooded. Once Admiral Andrew Cunningham, the commander-in-chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, learned of the plight of Pola, he sent his ships to hunt for the Italians, along with spotter planes to see what the disposition of the Italian fleet was. By nightfall, both Italian and British fleets, as Eno learned of Poe's plight at 8:10 p.m., in which some suggested sending destroyers to pick up the crew and scuttle the ship. Jaco refused this because of the information from Supermarina, and in which he thought the enemy formation, 75 miles to his east, was PRN Whipple's cruisers. He felt that the 1st Cruiser Division could handle them. Okino had this to say about his decision later. I had not the slightest idea that we were pursued so closely by the British fleet. Otherwise, I should not have abandoned the POA to her fate. So the 1st Cruiser Division, including Zara and Fiume, went to assist Pola along. With the 9th Destroyer Squadron at 10:10 p.m., as Valiant's radar pinpointed Poe about 6 mil to the southwest of the British battleships War. Spite B and Valiant, Vice Admiral Catano approached from the south while F's crew were getting ready to pass a Pola tow. The night was moonless and cloudless. Invisibility was not great, hovering at about 5,000 yard, Poe-sided shapes to the north, and believing they were friendly, fired a red flare to advertise her location. Zara saw the flare 45 degrees off for Port B, and turned in that direction at 10:25. One officer on Katana's bridge saw large warships off the bow, and it turned out Katana was unwittingly crossing Cunningham's T. Cunningham reacted rather quickly and swung his ships around to engage the Italians, just before the enemy cruisers were sighted. The Barham in the rear of the line had sighted the POA on the port quarter, making identification signals, and had trained her turrets onto her. When the Greyhound searchlight shone out, the Barham trained forward at once, opening fire on the lee ship. A brilliant orange flash shot up under the bridge and burst where alone. The whole length of the ship, which turned to starboard and made off to the westward, making smoke. Following this, the Italian destroyers tried to get into the engagement, but due to the concentrated firepower of the British ships, they were not very effective. Pa helplessly watched the slaughter of her sister ships, and by 1:40 a.m., the British destroyer Havoc, Griffin, and Greyhound had been circling Pa ready to pounce. However, they had expended their torpedoes, so again, the destroyer Jarvis came in to kill the crippled Italian cruiser. This time, though, she went in and saved 257 of Pa's crewmen, unlike another cruiser we'll talk about later. Then, she stood off and fired one torpedo and a newbie, and launched another at 4:03 a.m. Pa blew up and sank, losing 328 men in the process of this one-sided battle. I think Dioro and Benesco have an interesting description of the events. Polo helplessly, battle stations were ordered once again, but the chance of a response seemed minimal. Orders could not be transmitted due to the lack of power. The 4 203mm turrets could only be handled manually. The forward turrets could also fire electrically and under the local control, except for makeshift connections with night-firing direction stations. Only a few rounds were reaching the 100mm 47 caliber mountings, 2 of which were damaged. Some Cly symbolic gunfire would have been possible, but this, according to Depa, would not have only been in vain, but would have also attracted an enemy reaction. With serious losses among the personnel, at 11:15 he gave the order to abandon the ship and open the seacock. During these operations, at 11:45, the Polo was again discovered by the British destroyer Havoc, illuminated her, and then opened fire, hitting twice and causing many fires on the battery deck, AF, and the deckhouse midships. There was no reaction as the ship was sinking. The scuttling and abandonment proceeded slowly, the former due to communication failures and a Zara temporary halt procedure, the latter due to some confusion among the crew. Several men who had jumped overboard during Havoc's attack returned aboard due to the biting cold and were fortified with alcohol and had their wet clothes changed, going back to in lookouts on POA-setted shapes to the north, and believing that they were friendly, firing a red flare to advertise their location. Zara saw the flares about 45 degrees off her port B and turned in that direction. At 10:25, one officer on Catano's bridge saw large warships off the bow, and it turned out Catano was unwittingly crossing Cunningham's T. Cunningham reacted rather quickly and swung his ships around to engage the Italians. At 10:28, when HMS Greyhound switched on her searchlight, an officer on Zara's bridge said, "Why is he using his searchlight? Is he mad?" Within moments, the ship was taken under fire. Between 10:29 and 10:32, Zara was hit on the port side by 4 15-in salvos and just as many 6-in salvos from Warspite, 5 15-in salvos from Valiant, and 1 from Barham, all of this from a range of around 3,000 meters. A high proportion of rounds hit their target. About 20 out of the 62 or so fired from the various guns. According to British estimates, at least, Zara was hit in the bow. In a midships turret, 1 was destroyed. The muscles of the guns of turret 2 were deformed. The structures of the bridge were damaged, and the night fighting posts were unable to be attended to. The secondary armament and other weapons were wrecked on the port side. This all came with a considerable loss of life, and more were lost in the ensuing fires that came, breaking out in the middle of the ship. As a precaution, magazines were ordered to be flooded, although it is not clear if this was carried out. 2 boilers were completely destroyed in the machinery spaces, others damaged, and some in operational condition. However, not even all of them could be manned due to the loss of life. The ship also had no power at this point, and the operational rear turret couldn't traverse to get into position to fire. The ship was still afloat, and theoretically could make steam eventually and steer with great difficulty. But with the loss of so much of the crew, it would be difficult. Captain Luigi Corri ordered the helm hard to start, while under fire, and for a while Zara continued to move slowly. This was stopped by Admiral Cunningham, who, having ascertained the impossibility of saving the ship and avoiding the risk of an enemy boarding, decided to abandon the ship without waiting for dawn and therefore sink the ship by explosive charges. The evacuation took place in the early morning of the 29th, and the explosives were placed in the forward magazine. The ship capsized to starboard around 2:30 in the morning. Cunningham and Corri were lost, with some Zara, along with 35 others, 129 non-commissioned officers, 23 civilians, and 619 sailors. Meanwhile, what about Fum was following Zara and was Fiume equally as surprised by the bulk of the Mediterranean fleet coming in the opposite direction. The cruiser had ceased battle stations and had ordered normal sea stations with only 2 main armament turrets, 1 per group on standby. At that moment she was illuminated by that most valuable searchlight from the Greyhound, and soon after, between 10:27 and 10:28, she was hit on the port side at an average of 3,000 m by 2 15-in salvos from Warspite. 6 shells first, and then 8 4. 6-in salvos and 15-in salvo from Valiant. At least 6 rounds hit their target. Barham, after initially directing her fire at Zara, moved on to the Fiume, where she fired 6 15-in salvos and 7 salvos from her 6-in guns, giving a total of 55 shells fired from BM alone. At 10:32, the British battleship ceased fire and disengaged, all turning together. The Fiume was hit by at least 6 15-in shells, and a few 6-in shells were taken from Breezy End. Dear, we find out what kind of damage she sustained initially. The following were hit: Tillet 4, boiler number 8, starboard aft end by a projectile, which passed through the hull and exploded in a coffer dam on the opposite side of the ship, producing a large hole. The forecastle, the forward superstructure boilers number 3 and 4 in the second onslaught, the bridge, the auxiliary fire director, turret 2, and a gun from turret 3 were hit. It's safe to say things were not looking good, and after reading about the battle in detail, it amazes me it took until 11:15 for her to go down as a result of these hits. The night firing direction, 100mm 47 caliber guns, boiler rooms 34 and 8, and gun turret 4 were destroyed. The F deck was heavily bowed upward, and a huge gash was opened in the center of the ship. Shockingly, electrical power was cut off from the ship. The port engine stopped, and the cruiser sank, lurching noticeably, which led to the false assumption of torpedoing. The starboard engine in boilers 1 and 2 were actually unharmed, and therefore, theoretically, she could make steam, and possibly the firefighting equipment could be used to fight the raging fires. And turret 4, amidships, and forward of turret 2. At first, it was ordered for Fiume to make the highest possible speed, which was about 10 knots, but quickly the captain realized it was impossible to save the ship, and for the engines to be stopped, so the crew could abandon the doomed cruiser. Fiume maintained her steerage for about 10 minutes, an impressive feat considering the damage she received. Scuttling charges were set at the order of the commanding officer, Captain Georgios, and ordered the ship to be abandoned. S sank at 11:15, capsizing to her starboard side. 1 officer, 1 non-commissioned officer, 681 ratings, 5 civilians, and 4 airmen slipped beneath the waves. The high casualties were attributable to the lack of power, making it difficult to communicate in. The confused situation, but S and Deoro write the primary cause to the Fiume sinking was the single 15-inch hit in the vicinity of boiler number 8 in the destruction of the bulkheads as a result of the other 2 hits that encouraged the rapid spread of flooding, as well as the lack of any means of pumping due to the loss of all sources of power. Otherwise, the ship would have floated motionless and in flames, as happened to background Zara. Before we continue, I'll put up a figure that lists the casualties among Italian ships during the overall operation, as it's pretty staggering. Another thing I want to cover is how the Regia Marina looked at the losses, and of course look at the Royal Navy and the Allies, starting with the Regia Marina after the Battle of Cape Matapan. Writes about some of the issues, writing the consequence of limiting for some time our operational activities, not for the serious moral effect of the losses, as the British believe, but because the operation revealed our inferiority in effective aeronaval cooperation, the backwardness of our technology. In fact, it shocked the Regia Marina's leaderships that even its most modern and powerful battleships could not conduct an offensive operation with a reasonable hope of success. According to Vincent Poe O'Hara, in the struggle for the Middle Sea, the great navies at war in the Mediterranean theater 1940 to 1945, this seemed to vindicate the fleet and being strategy, and provided a cautionary lesson in a value of German cooperation, but also in the danger of adopting German ideas of offensive naval warfare. According to the government's orders, I and our naval forces were not to venture outside land fighter aircraft range, and we were to avoid night clashes until we were equipped with radar. The DUA had already ordered the oft-delayed conversion of the liner Roma into an aircraft carrier. The Navy also began a serious effort to equip its ships with radar. One of these prototypes went into testing in April. The war was 10 months old, and the Italian government realized it might continue for a long time. When looking at the Royal Navy's reflections from the battle, there's no better place to look than the Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, Admiral Andrew Cunningham, as his reflections are found in dark seas. The results of the action cannot be viewed with entire satisfaction, since the damaged Vector Veto was allowed to escape the failure of the cruisers, and destroyers to make contact with her during the night was unlucky and is much regretted. Nevertheless, substantial results were achieved in the destruction of 3 Zara-class crew cruisers. These fast, well-armed and armored ships had always been a source of anxiety as a threat to our own less well-armed cruisers, and I was well content to see them disposed of in the summy fashion. There's little doubt that the rough handling given the enemy on this occasion served us in good stead during the subsequent evacuation of Greece and Crete. Much of these later operations may be said to have been conducted under the cover of the Battle of Cape Matapan. I'll close out with that same quote opened with from Regia. The 4 Zara-class ships were surely the best Italian heavy cruisers in the exceptional conditions of the loss of Zara and Fiume at Matapan. Wrecked by 15-inch shells at almost point-blank range, do not allow a fair judgment of their robustness to be made at the Battle of Cape. Tutapal hit the cruiser HMS Barrick with 2 8-inch shells, knocking out one of her 8-inch turrets in the brief gunfire action of the First Battle of Sea in December 1941. Gia damaged the destroyer HM Kipling with a near miss. These Z-class ships were truly beautiful ships, like the other Regia Marina designs. It isn't fair to judge the robustness based on this action. Thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.